May 16th, 1770. Versailles Palace. A 15-year-old boy and 14-year-old girl are forced into bed together while dozens of nobles watch through the doorway, waiting. The bed is blessed by the Archbishop. The doors finally close, and for the next 7 years, nothing happens. Absolutely nothing. This medical secret, whispered through the gilded halls of the most powerful palace in Europe, would eventually spark a revolution that claimed 40,000 lives and sent both their heads rolling into a basket. What if I told you that the fall of the French monarchy didn't begin with bread riots or political corruption, but in a royal bedroom where a young king couldn't perform his most basic duty? Historians have debated this for centuries, but the dark truth hidden in royal correspondence and physician reports reveals something far more disturbing than you were ever taught in school. This is the story of how one intimate failure destroyed an empire. Before we descend into this darkness together, I need you to do something. If you believe history's most brutal truths deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button right now. These stories matter. They're real. They're hidden. And together, we're bringing them to light. Don't let this be the last time you hear the truth. Now, let's begin where it all went wrong. The Chapel Royal at Versailles gleamed with 6,000 candles that day. Outside, 200,000 Parisians watched fireworks explode over the palace gardens, celebrating the alliance between France and Austria. Inside, 5,000 nobles in silken powder crammed into the gilded halls, their eyes fixed on two children dressed like porcelain dolls. But nobody was prepared for what the storm clouds gathering overhead truly meant. The ceremony itself was a spectacle of grotesque excess. Marie Antoinette's dress weighed so much she could barely walk. Young Louis Auguste, Duke of Berry, soon to be Louis XVI, stood rigid in his ceremonial armor, sweating beneath the weight of expectation and velvet. They had never met before today. She spoke barely any French. He had been raised in isolation, taught nothing about women, nothing about intimacy, only duty and God and France. When the vows finished, the real nightmare began. The bedding ceremony was not a suggestion. It was law. It was proof. It was the moment where marriage became real in the eyes of the state and the church. The Archbishop of Reims led the procession down the Hall of Mirrors toward the royal bedchamber, his voice droning Latin blessings that echoed off the ceiling frescoes. Behind him, a parade of the highest nobility in France, each one holding candles, each one knowing exactly what they were about to witness, or at least what they were supposed to witness. The doors to the bedchamber opened. The bed itself had been prepared for hours. Servants had perfumed the sheets with rosewater and lavender. The mattress had been blessed 3 times. The curtains were pulled back so nothing could be hidden. This was theater. This was politics. This was the most intimate moment of 2 human lives turned into a public transaction. King Louis XV, the grandfather, stepped forward first. His wrinkled hands held a white silk nightshirt embroidered with gold fleur-de-lis. He handed it to his grandson with a knowing look, a look that said, "You are a man now. You must perform." On the other side of the bed, the Duchess of Chartres did the same for Marie Antoinette, slipping a delicate lace nightgown over her trembling shoulders. The girl was crying, but nobody acknowledged it. Tears were expected. Tears were part of the ritual. They were tucked into bed like children, because that's what they were. Children. The Archbishop made the sign of the cross over their bodies. He blessed their union. He blessed their future sons. He blessed the continuation of the Bourbon bloodline. And then, one by one, the nobles filed out, their candles casting long shadows on the walls, their footsteps fading into silence. But not all of them left. Protocol demanded that certain officials remain nearby, just outside the door, listening, waiting, ready to verify in the morning what had occurred, ready to inspect the sheets for the proof that nobility required. Blood. The door closed, the candles flickered, and in that moment, in that suffocating golden prison, nothing happened. Nothing at all. And that silence, that failure, that absence of what should have been, would echo through history louder than any guillotine blade ever could. Morning arrived with the cruelty of daylight. Servants entered the royal bedchamber, expecting to find the evidence that protocol demanded. Instead, they found pristine sheets, unbloodied, untouched. The whispers began before breakfast. By noon, every corridor in Versailles knew. The young king had failed. Not in battle, not in politics. In something far more primal. Something that even peasants could accomplish on their wedding night. The court, that vicious machine of silk and poison, began to turn its gears. Marie Antoinette woke each day to a new humiliation. Ladies-in-waiting would ask, with false sweetness dripping from their painted lips, whether she felt unwell. Whether perhaps she needed the royal physician. The subtext was always clear. A real woman would have made her husband want her. The Austrian girl, barely 15, had no one to confide in. Her mother's letters arrived weekly from Vienna, each one more desperate than the last. You must make him desire you. The alliance depends on it. Everything depends on it. But how could she explain what she didn't understand herself? Louis retreated into obsession. While other kings held court and made war, he spent 18 hours a day in the palace locksmith workshop, covered in grease and metal shavings, building intricate mechanisms that clicked and turned and made sense. Locks had keys. Locks had solutions. His body did not. King Louis XV, the grandfather who had kept dozens of mistresses and fathered God knows how many bastards, could barely look at his heir. The old man would corner the boy in hallways, demanding to know what was wrong, why he couldn't perform this most basic function of kingship. The humiliation was worse than any public execution. At least execution ended. October 28th, 1772, 2 years into the marriage. The confrontation finally happened. Physicians were summoned. Not 1, but 5. They examined the young king's body like butchers inspecting meat. Louis, shaking with shame, admitted through tears that he felt pain always preventing him from completing the act. The doctors argued. One claimed it was purely physical, a tightness of the foreskin that could be resolved with surgery. Another insisted it was psychological, the boy's weakness of character. A third suggested the queen was the problem, that perhaps her Austrian blood made her somehow incompatible with French royalty. None of them could agree. None of them could fix him. Marie Antoinette stopped trying. She abandoned the royal bedroom altogether and threw herself into the only escape Versailles offered. Excess. Gambling tables that swallowed fortunes. Masked balls that lasted until dawn. Theater performances where she could pretend to be anyone except herself. The court watched her transformation from innocent child to desperate woman and called her frivolous. Called her a spendthrift. Called her everything except what she truly was. Abandoned. Meanwhile, the Austrian ambassador sent encrypted letters back to Vienna. The marriage remains barren. The alliance weakens daily. France and Austria's future hangs on the performance of a boy who cannot perform. Political enemies circled like sharks smelling blood in the water. And in Paris, in the underground printing houses where revolution was already being imagined, the pamphleteers sharpened their quills and prepared to turn private failure into public spectacle. April 1777. A carriage bearing the seal of the Holy Roman Empire crossed into French territory. Inside sat Emperor Joseph II, Marie Antoinette's older brother, a man known for brutal honesty and zero tolerance for incompetence. He had not come for a friendly visit. Vienna was losing patience. The alliance was crumbling. He had orders from their mother, Empress Maria Theresa, to discover what in God's name was happening behind the closed doors of Versailles. What he found was worse than anyone imagined. Joseph demanded a private audience with his sister. No attendants, no eavesdroppers. Marie Antoinette broke down completely. Between sobs, she confessed that her husband would come to her bed occasionally, perform what seemed like the motions of intimacy, and then simply leave. No passion, no completion, just duty, executed with the same enthusiasm one might show toward filling out tax documents. She didn't understand why. She thought perhaps she was broken. Perhaps God was punishing her. Joseph's next conversation was with Louis himself. The meeting took place in the king's private study. Surrounded by the intricate locks and mechanical devices the young monarch built to escape reality, Joseph didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked the question that all of Europe wanted answered. What was preventing the consummation? Louis's response made the emperor physically recoil. The king described, in painful detail, how he would introduce the member and remain there for perhaps 2 minutes without moving, before withdrawing, still erect, without ever ejaculating. He did this, he explained, because it was his duty. He felt no pleasure. He saw no point in prolonging the act. Then he would bid his wife good night and return to his workshop. Joseph sat in stunned silence. The realization crashed over him like ice water. They didn't know. These two royal children, married for 7 years, raised in the most sophisticated courts in Europe, literally did not understand how human reproduction worked. Nobody had taught them. Not the physicians, not the advisors, not the corrupt old men who had orchestrated their wedding and then abandoned them to figure out biology on their own. The emperor wrote a letter that night that still exists in the Austrian archives. In it, he called them 2 complete blunderers. He described the situation as incredible. Here was the King of France, the most powerful man in continental Europe, who could order armies to march and heads to roll, but he could not perform the basic mechanics of creating an heir, because nobody had ever explained it to him. Joseph spent the next week giving the couple what amounted to a clinical sex education. The conversations were mortifying. Marie Antoinette cried. Louis turned crimson and stammered. But Joseph persisted. He drew diagrams. He used language so blunt it would make a sailor blush. He explained movement, rhythm, the necessity of actual physical engagement rather than just mechanical insertion. The question of surgery lingered. Had there been a procedure? Multiple physicians had examined Louis and found nothing anatomically wrong. Some historians claim a circumcision happened. Others insist the problem was purely psychological and educational. The truth died with them. But what mattered was that Joseph finally gave them the knowledge that their own kingdom had failed to provide. 3 months later, something shifted. August 18th, 1777. The date Marie Antoinette would later mark in her journal with trembling hands. The marriage was finally, truly consummated. The date burned itself into history. August 18th. 7 years, 3 months, and 2 days after the wedding that should have sealed their fate. When it finally happened, there were no witnesses, no blessed sheets, no trumpets announcing victory. Just 2 people in a dark room, finally understanding what their bodies were meant to do. Joseph's departure from Versailles left behind a strange silence. He had returned to Austria, with promises extracted and instructions delivered. Marie Antoinette, for the first time since arriving in France as a child bride, felt something resembling hope. Perhaps this nightmare could end. Perhaps she could finally become what everyone demanded she be, a vessel for the future of France. By December, whispers of a different kind rippled through the palace. The queen had missed her monthly bleeding. Physicians were summoned, not to examine the king this time, but her. The confirmation came like thunder. She was with child. The court erupted in cautious celebration. Cautious, because 7 years of failure had taught everyone that nothing about this couple could be trusted until proven absolutely real. April 1778. The pregnancy became impossible to hide. Marie Antoinette's body, which had remained frustratingly barren for so long, now swelled with undeniable life. Letters flew between Versailles and Vienna. Empress Maria Theresa wept with relief. The alliance was saved. The bloodline would continue. France would have an heir. December 19th, 1778. The birth nearly killed her. Custom demanded that royal births be witnessed by anyone of sufficient rank who could crowd into the room. Over 200 people packed into the bedchamber, pushing and shoving for a view, their breath fogging the air, their bodies creating a suffocating wall of humanity. Marie Antoinette, screaming in labor, fainted from lack of oxygen. They had to smash windows with chairs to let in freezing winter air. When consciousness returned, she heard the cry. A daughter. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. Madame Royale. Not a son, not an heir, but proof, finally, that the king and queen could produce children. Louis wept when he held his daughter. 8 years. 8 years of humiliation and shame, culminating in this tiny, red-faced creature who would inherit nothing because she was born female. But she was real. She was alive. She was theirs. The celebrations lasted 3 days. Fountains in Paris ran with wine. Church bells rang across the kingdom. Fireworks exploded over Versailles in patterns that spelled out the baby's name in light and smoke. Everyone pretended that 8 years of gossip could be erased by one successful birth. Everyone pretended the damage wasn't already catastrophic. Because while Louis and Marie Antoinette were learning to be parents, while they were celebrating their hard-won intimacy, the presses in London and Amsterdam were churning out fresh pamphlets. The pornographic poems had already been written. The cartoons had already been drawn. The libel had already spread like plague through every corner of Europe. 8 years was long enough for the secret to become legend. Long enough for the king's dysfunction to transform from medical condition into political weapon. The child born in December 1778 would die in a different France. A France that had stopped believing its king was capable of anything at all. London, 1779. In a basement workshop hidden beneath a bookshop on Fleet Street, a printer named Charles Thévenot de Morande was setting type for the most dangerous publication of his career. The ink was still wet on copper engravings that depicted the King and Queen of France in positions that would make a brothel madam blush. This wasn't journalism. This wasn't satire. This was assassination by paper and ink. The underground publishing industry had been watching Versailles for years, waiting for ammunition. The unconsummated marriage had been rumor. Gossip traded between diplomats over wine. But now, with enough confirmation leaking from palace servants and disgruntled courtiers, the floodgates opened. What had been Louis's private medical nightmare was about to become France's most popular entertainment. The first pamphlet hit Paris streets in spring. Les amours de Charlot et Toinette. The loves of Charlie and Toinette. The title sounded innocent enough. The contents were radioactive. Page after page described in explicit, pornographic detail how the impotent king watched while his wife took lovers. The Count of Artois, Louis's own brother, Swedish diplomats, stable boys, anyone with functioning anatomy that the king allegedly lacked. None of it was true. All of it was believed. Within weeks, every tavern in Paris had a copy. Merchants read passages aloud to crowds in marketplaces. The cost to print a single edition was 17,400 livres, more than most peasants earned in 5 years. Someone was funding this operation. Someone with deep pockets and deeper hatred wanted the monarchy destroyed one humiliating paragraph at a time. The French government panicked. Agents were dispatched to London with trunks full of gold, orders to buy every copy, bribe every printer, burn every plate. They tried kidnapping the publishers. They tried blackmail. They tried appealing to British authorities to shut down the presses. The British laughed in their faces. Freedom of the press, they said, while their printing houses ran 3 shifts a day to meet French demand. In Amsterdam, another hub of underground publishing, the pamphlets evolved. Cartoons appeared showing Louis with exaggerated physical deformities. His body drawn small, weak, feminized. Marie Antoinette towering over him, a lustful monster devouring France's wealth and dignity. The medical condition that had caused Louis pain and shame was now drawn as comedy. As proof that God himself rejected this king. The Bastille prison began filling with booksellers caught distributing the libel. But for everyone arrested, 3 more appeared. The forbidden nature of the material made it more valuable. Nobles who publicly condemned the pamphlets kept private collections hidden behind false walls in their libraries. Even priests were caught reading them, claiming they needed to understand the enemy's weapons. By 1785, when Marie Antoinette gave birth to her 3rd child, Louis Charles, The pamphleteers had already decided the narrative. The boy was born exactly 9 months after Swedish diplomat Axel von Fersen returned to court. The timing was coincidence. The damage was permanent. Whispers that the future heir wasn't even the king's son spread faster than plague. Louis XVI couldn't defend himself without confirming the dysfunction everyone already mocked. He was trapped in a cage built from his own body's failures, and the key was in the hands of men who would never let him out. There was an ancient belief running through European monarchy, like blood through veins. A king's power over his kingdom flowed directly from his power over his own body. If you couldn't control your flesh, you couldn't control your empire. The Romans knew it. The Caesars proved it. And 18th century France still believed it with religious fervor. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had understood this instinctively. He kept mistresses the way other men kept horses, publicly, proudly, as demonstration of virility that translated directly into political dominance. When Louis XIV took a new lover, foreign ambassadors reported it back to their capitals as intelligence about France's strength. The king's bedroom performance was national security. His great-grandson possessed no such power. The pamphlets didn't just mock Louis XVI's dysfunction. They systematically unmanned him in the public imagination. Cartoons circulated, showing him wearing dresses, his body drawn soft and round like a woman's. In one particularly vicious illustration, Marie Antoinette held a riding crop, while Louis knelt at her feet in pearls and makeup. The message was unsubtle. This creature wearing the crown had been transformed into something less than male, therefore less than king, therefore less than human. The psychological warfare cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. France had lost the 7 Years' War in 1763, surrendering vast territories to Britain. That was merely military humiliation. But a king who couldn't satisfy his own wife? That was cosmic failure. It suggested God himself had withdrawn favor from the Bourbon line. In a culture where divine right justified absolute monarchy, impotence became theological crisis. Street songs emerged, sung by children in Paris markets, their innocent voices carrying poison. The king can make locks, but not heirs. The double meaning was deliberate. Louis's obsession with locksmithing, his retreat into mechanical devices, became evidence of inadequacy. Real men conquered. Real men bred. Real men didn't hide in workshops building toys while their kingdoms crumbled. Marie Antoinette's image twisted in parallel. Initially portrayed as victim of an incompetent husband, the narrative shifted once she finally bore children. Now she became the monster. The foreign temptress who had emasculated French royalty through some combination of Austrian witchcraft and unnatural appetite. The woman who had waited 7 years for consummation was rewritten as an insatiable predator destroying France from within. The genius of this propaganda was its unfalsifiability. Louis couldn't defend his masculinity without discussing intimate details that would only confirm the accusations. Silence looked like guilt. Response looked like weakness. He was checkmated by his own biology, trapped in a narrative that reduced complex medical reality to simple, devastating symbolism. The impotent king and his whore queen. By 1788, when financial crisis forced Louis to convene the Estates General for the first time in over a century, the real battle was already lost. He entered those negotiations already defeated in the court of public opinion. The deputies who would eventually vote for his execution had spent years consuming propaganda that taught them their king was fundamentally incapable. Not incapable of governance, though that too, but incapable at the most basic animal level of existence. You cannot lead a nation if the nation believes you cannot lead your own body. The guillotine was already being built in their minds, one pornographic pamphlet at a time. Charles Gravier, Count of Vergennes, French Minister of Foreign Affairs, sat in his office at Versailles, staring at intelligence reports that made his blood run cold. The year was 1783. His network of spies across Europe had compiled a list. 47 printing houses in London alone were producing anti-monarchy materials. Amsterdam had 32. Even Geneva, supposedly neutral Switzerland, harbored 19 presses churning out libel faster than France could burn it. He had an annual budget of 600,000 livres dedicated exclusively to suppression. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The first strategy seemed simple. Buy the entire print runs before they reached France. French agents arrived in London with diplomatic pouches stuffed with gold, making offers to publishers. Some took the money. Many took the money and printed additional copies with the French government's bribe funding expanded operations. The economics were too perfect. France would pay premium prices for materials that cost pennies to produce, creating a perverse incentive structure where the more the government tried to suppress, the more profitable production became. Agent Louis-Dominique Blanc de la Notte operated under the alias Baron de Thurn, posing as a wealthy collector of rare political materials. He spent 3 years in London's printing district, building relationships, attending secret auctions, mapping the entire underground network. His reports back to Versailles grew increasingly desperate. The system was too distributed, too international, too profitable. Shutting down one operation just drove 3 others deeper underground. Then came the kidnapping attempts. Spring 1784. French operatives grabbed pamphleteer Thévenot de Morand from a London street, dragged him into a carriage, and nearly made it to Dover before British authorities intercepted them at gunpoint. The diplomatic incident was catastrophic. Britain's newspapers exploded with coverage of French despotism, trying to silence free press on British soil. The attempted kidnapping became its own scandal, generating more anti-French sentiment than the original pamphlets ever could. The Bastille became warehouse and prison simultaneously. Cellars filled with seized materials, over 15,000 confiscated pamphlets moldering in the darkness alongside the humans who distributed them. But even this backfired. Guards could be bribed. Prison conditions created martyrs. Booksellers arrested 1 week were replaced by 3 more the next, each one emboldened by stories of persecution. The ultimate irony manifested in 1787 when investigators discovered that some of the most damaging anti-monarchy propaganda was being produced by French citizens inside France itself. The underground network had metastasized beyond foreign shores. Parisians were writing, printing, and distributing materials mocking their own king, then falsely attributing authorship to London publishers to avoid prosecution. Vergennes died in 1787. His mission failed. His successor inherited an impossible task: suppress information that everyone already knew, in an age where information had learned to root around censorship like water flowing downhill. The monarchy's inability to control its own narrative became another form of impotence, political rather than physical, but just as fatal. Every pamphlet burned created legend of 10 more hidden. Every printer arrested became folk hero in tavern songs. Every failed suppression attempt proved the revolution's most powerful argument. This government could no longer govern, not even its own image. The blade being sharpened for Louis XVI's neck was being cast in ink as much as steel. Paris, summer of 1789. A baker's apprentice who couldn't read still knew the king was broken. He'd heard it in the tavern songs his father sang. He'd seen it in the crude drawings chalked on alley walls, showing a crown sitting atop a limp, wilted flower. He'd absorbed it through the very air of the city, thick with contempt that had fermented over 2 decades into something poisonous and permanent. This was the true victory of the propaganda war. It had seeped into the bones of France itself. You didn't need literacy to understand the message. The imagery was primal. The mockery was universal. From duchesses whispering behind fans to fishwives shouting across market stalls, everyone knew the same dirty secret. The king couldn't perform. Therefore, the king couldn't rule. The psychology was ancient and brutal. In farming villages where survival depended on breeding livestock, where harvest failures meant starvation, fertility was power. A bull that couldn't mount was slaughtered. A rooster that couldn't crow was dinner. The peasant logic applied upward. A king who couldn't breed was already dead. His body just hadn't realized it yet. When bread prices doubled in 1788, when winter came early, and grain rotted in flooded fields, when mothers watched their children's bellies distend from hunger, the rage needed a target. Economic theory was incomprehensible. Global trade patterns were abstract. But the impotent king and his wasteful foreign wife? That story made perfect, terrible sense. The October March on Versailles crystallized everything. Thousands of women, armed with kitchen knives and pikes, walked 21 kilometers in pouring rain to drag the royal family back to Paris. As they marched, they sang verses that reduced Marie Antoinette to the Austrian whore and Louis to the cuckold. The sexual humiliation wasn't peripheral to their grievance. It was central. They were coming to discipline a dysfunctional household that had failed France the way a neglectful father fails his children. When the mob broke into Versailles, they weren't just seeking political change. They were enacting symbolic castration. Searching for Marie Antoinette through the palace corridors, they screamed that they would cut out her heart and string her guts for ribbons. The violence was sexualized because the propaganda had sexualized the monarchy. Decades of pornographic pamphlets had taught the masses to imagine their rulers' bodies in graphic detail, and now those imagined bodies would be made to bleed in equally graphic reality. By the time Louis stood before the National Convention in 1792, the verdict was already written in the collective unconscious of France. The charges would be treason and conspiracy. But underneath, unspoken but universally understood, was the original sin. He had been inadequate from the beginning. Inadequate in the marriage bed. Inadequate on the throne. Inadequate as the living embodiment of France itself. The people had decided, not through debate or philosophy, but through years of absorbing poison disguised as entertainment. They had learned to despise their king's body, and from that bodily contempt flowed contempt for everything he represented. The guillotine waiting in Place de la Révolution wasn't just execution machinery. It was the final humiliation for a man whose humiliation had never really ended since that first failed wedding night 23 years earlier. June 20th, 1791, 11:30 at night. A heavy Berlin carriage rolled through the gates of the Tuileries Palace in Paris, its windows covered, its wheels muffled with cloth to deaden sound. Inside, disguised as servants of a fictional Russian baroness, sat the King and Queen of France with their children, attempting what would become history's most catastrophic mistake. The plan had taken months to orchestrate. Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, rumored to be Marie Antoinette's lover, coordinated every detail. False passports prepared under the name Madame Korff. Loyal officers positioned troops along the escape route toward the Austrian Netherlands, where Marie Antoinette's family would provide sanctuary. On paper, the scheme was flawless. In execution, it was doomed from the moment Louis insisted on bringing his wine collection. The carriage was too large, too slow, too ostentatious for a party supposedly fleeing in secret. But Louis refused to abandon the luxuries that defined his existence, even as that existence crumbled. They lumbered through the French countryside at a pace that allowed peasants on foot to keep up, pointing and whispering. 21 hours later, the nightmare materialized in Varennes-en-Argonne, a town 40 kilometers from safety. Jean-Baptiste Drouin, the local postmaster, had been studying faces on coins for years as part of his job. When the suspicious carriage stopped to change horses at midnight, he held a lantern up to the window and saw Louis's profile match perfectly with the image stamped on an ECU piece in his pocket. The king's own face, mass-produced on currency, betrayed him. What followed was a different species of horror than battlefield defeat. No violence. No blood. Just recognition. Just exposure. The postmaster sounded the alarm. Within minutes, villagers surrounded the carriage, not with weapons raised, but with accusatory stares that cut deeper than any blade. They knew. Everyone knew. The king who couldn't rule his own body now couldn't even escape his own kingdom. The National Guard arrived at dawn. Lafayette's men treated Louis with procedural correctness that somehow felt more humiliating than chains would have been. He wasn't arrested as an enemy. He was collected as wayward property, like retrieving a senile grandfather who'd wandered from the nursing home. The return journey took 3 days that felt like public execution by 1,000 cuts. The same carriage that carried them toward freedom now became their rolling prison, forced to retrace every kilometer at walking speed so citizens could line the roads and bear witness. Women who'd marched on Versailles 2 years earlier now stood watching their king's defeated return, their faces masks of contempt. No one threw stones. No one needed to. The humiliation was in the silence, in the way children pointed and parents explained in loud voices that this was the man who abandoned France, who tried to run to Austria for help, proving every accusation the pamphlets had made. The impotent king, now the coward king. The inadequate man, now the traitor. When the carriage finally rolled back into Paris on June 25th, a crowd of 100,000 waited in absolute, crushing quiet. Not a cheer, not a threat. Just the sound of the king's failure echoing off cobblestones. December 11th, 1792. The former king entered the convention chamber stripped of every title that had defined him. Not Your Majesty. Not Louis XVI. Just Louis Capet, a surname borrowed from ancestors dead 5 centuries, reducing him to the status of any common defendant awaiting judgment. The iron chest had sealed his fate weeks earlier. Discovered hidden behind walls in the Tuileries on November 20th, it contained correspondence that proved what the propaganda had always claimed. Louis had been conspiring against the revolution from the beginning. Letters to his émigré brothers, secret payments to assembly members, communications with foreign monarchs planning invasion. The physical evidence of treason, locked away like his own guilty conscience given form. 33 charges were read aloud, each one meticulously documented, each one answered with responses that ranged from denial to pathetic deflection. I do not recollect. The fault lies with my ministers. I was entirely ignorant. The man who once held absolute power now claimed absolute ignorance of how that power was wielded. It convinced no one. But beneath the legal proceedings lurked the unspoken judgment that had already condemned him years before any court convened. The deputies watching Louis shuffle papers and stammer answers weren't just evaluating treason. They were measuring the man himself against the archetype of what a king should be, and finding him catastrophically insufficient in ways both political and primal. Raymond de Sèze, his defense attorney, had 4 days to prepare arguments that should have taken months. The man worked without sleep, knowing he was constructing rhetoric to hold back a tidal wave. On December 26th, he stood before the convention and delivered 3 hours of eloquence defending a client he knew was already dead. He argued constitutional immunity. He challenged the convention's authority to serve as both prosecutor and judge. He dismantled the evidence piece by piece with legal precision that would have swayed any impartial court. The convention was not impartial. It was a pack of predators watching wounded prey bleed out. When the vote came on January 15th, 1793, the numbers told a story more brutal than any guillotine. 693 deputies voted guilty. 23 abstained. Not one, not a single voice in that entire assembly voted innocent. The unanimity wasn't about evidence. It was about something deeper, something that had been building since that failed wedding night 23 years earlier. The collective decision that this man had never been fit to rule, had never been fit to wear the crown, had never been fit to embody France. The deputies who voted death included Louis's own cousin, the Duke of Orleans, who rechristened himself Philippe Égalité. Family ties dissolved in the acid of revolutionary fervor and personal ambition. The man who shared Louis's blood cast his vote, knowing it would send that blood spilling onto cobblestones. There would be no appeal, no reprieve, no mercy. The margin was narrow. A handful of votes separated execution from imprisonment, but narrow still meant dead. The convention ordered immediate death by guillotine. 6 days to settle affairs. 6 days to write final letters. 6 days to prepare for the blade. The inadequate king would finally perform one act adequately. Dying. 5 in the morning. Still dark. The sound of boots on stone echoing through the temple prison corridors. Louis dressed himself slowly, fingers trembling over buttons he'd fastened 1,000 times before. His valet, Jean-Baptiste Cléry, who had served him through imprisonment and humiliation, now helped prepare him for death with the same care once reserved for coronation robes. The mass was offered in dim candlelight. bread and wine transformed into body and blood, the ultimate Christian reversal. God becoming flesh, so flesh could become God. Louis consumed the Eucharist knowing that in 3 hours, his own body and blood would be separated by industrial machinery designed for efficiency, not divinity. 8 o'clock. A green carriage waited like a hearse. The 2-hour journey through Paris streets was designed as theater. 80,000 soldiers lined the route, not to protect the prisoner, but to protect the execution from interruption. Every intersection occupied, every square fortified. The entire city transformed into an armed corridor leading to one inevitable destination. Inside the carriage, Father Edgeworth de Furmont prayed, while Louis stared through the window at a city he no longer recognized. The Paris of his coronation had become something alien, feeding on rage that had fermented for decades. He saw faces in the crowd, not hateful, which might have been understandable, but curious, eager, waiting to witness what had never happened in French history. A king killed by his own people under color of law. 10:15. The carriage stopped at Place de la Révolution. The spot where his grandfather's statue once stood now held different monument, wooden scaffold rising above the crowd, the guillotine's blade catching morning light like a pendulum frozen at the apex of its swing. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, had killed hundreds. This was merely another morning's work. He received Louis with professional courtesy. Remove the coat, remove the cravat, open the collar. Louis initially refused the binding of hands. Even now, some small dignity to preserve. Father Edgeworth convinced him otherwise. They used the king's own handkerchief instead of rope. A minor concession that felt monumental. The haircutting came next. Sanson's assistants worked quickly, shearing Louis like livestock. The locks fell onto the scaffold boards and were pocketed. Later they would be sold as revolutionary souvenirs, fragments of destroyed majesty. Louis climbed stairs that led nowhere but down. At the top, he tried to speak. His voice carried across the assembled crowd. "I die innocent." But Santerre ordered the drums. The rolling thunder swallowed whatever final words the King of France wanted to leave behind. History would never know if he proclaimed forgiveness, cursed his executioners, or simply begged for mercy like any other human facing obliteration. 10:22. They strapped him to the plank face down, neck positioned in the lunette. The weight of his head rested against wood that had held countless others. Charles-Henri Sanson released the blade. Gravity completed what propaganda had begun 23 years earlier. The assistant grabbed the severed head by its hair and raised it high. 20,000 voices erupted. Vive la République! The artillery salute that followed reached the Temple prison, where Marie Antoinette heard the cannons and knew she was now a widow waiting her turn. Marie Antoinette survived her husband by 9 months. Not survived, existed. She became Widow Capet, a ghost haunting the Temple prison in widow's black, refusing food, refusing exercise, refusing everything except the hope that somehow her children might be spared what she knew was coming. July 3rd, 1793, 2 in the morning. They came for her son. Louis Charles, 8 years old, ripped screaming from her arms under the pretense of protecting him from an escape plot. The real reason was crueler. Psychological torture designed to break whatever remained of her spirit before the trial. For weeks afterward, she could hear him sobbing through the prison walls. The boy who should have been Louis XVII, reduced to a crying child in the darkness. August 1st. Another midnight extraction. This time, they came for Marie Antoinette herself, transferring her to the conciergerie, the antechamber to death. The cell was damp, dark, barely large enough to lie down. She developed uterine hemorrhaging that soaked through her dress. The guards watching her day and night saw everything. Even dying, she couldn't have privacy. October 14th. The trial lasted 15 hours. 40 witnesses testified. The charges included conspiracy with foreign powers, depleting the treasury, and one accusation so vile that even the Revolutionary Tribunal found it embarrassing: incest with her own son. They had coached the traumatized 8-year-old to make the claim. When the prosecutor read it aloud, Marie Antoinette stood and addressed the women in the courtroom directly. "I appeal to all mothers present." The room fell silent. Even hatred has limits. But not mercy. 4 in the morning on October 16th, the verdict: guilty on all counts. Death by guillotine. That same day, unlike Louis, who rode to execution in a closed carriage, they paraded Marie Antoinette through Paris in an open cart like common livestock. Her hair had gone completely white. She was 37, but looked 70. Artist Jacques-Louis David sketched her from the crowd. The drawing shows a woman already dead, her face a skull, with skin stretched over bone. 12:15 in the afternoon. Place de la Révolution, same spot where her husband died. She accidentally stepped on executioner Charles-Henri Sanson's foot climbing the scaffold. Her last words: "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Politeness maintained even at the moment of obliteration. The blade fell. The crowd cheered. France was free of its monsters. Except the monster was just beginning to feed. The reign of terror that followed consumed 40,000 lives over 10 months. Maximilien Robespierre, who orchestrated Marie Antoinette's death, followed her to the guillotine less than a year later. The revolution devoured its children with the same appetite it had shown destroying its kings. Marie Antoinette's son, Louis Charles, died in prison at age 10 from tuberculosis and neglect. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived, the only member of the immediate family to escape. She lived to 72, carrying memories of parents destroyed by circumstances that began with something as simple and tragic as a medical condition in a teenage boy's body. The 2 children blessed in that bed on May 16th, 1770, were both dead by autumn 1793. The Blessed Union had produced not heirs, but corpses. 2 centuries later, physicians still argue over a dead king's penis. Medical journals publish studies analyzing 18th century correspondence like crime scene evidence. Urologists write papers titled "The Sexual Dysfunction of Louis XVI," with the same clinical detachment once used to examine his living body. The condition that destroyed a monarchy has become academic curiosity, dissected in fluorescent-lit conference rooms by people who will never understand what it meant to be that terrified teenage boy. The phimosis theory dominates modern analysis. Medical historians point to the documented pain Louis described, the 7-year delay, the sudden resolution after Emperor Joseph's intervention in 1777. A tight foreskin causing painful erections explains everything neatly. Simple mechanical problem, potentially solved by minor surgery, or even just time and physical maturity. Case closed. Except the evidence contradicts itself. Multiple royal physicians examined Louis between 1770 and 1777. Some reported finding anatomical abnormality. Others found nothing physically wrong whatsoever. If the condition was severe enough to prevent consummation for 7 years, how did different doctors reach opposite conclusions? Were some lying to protect the king's dignity? Were others incompetent? Or was the truth more complicated than a single medical diagnosis could capture? The psychological interpretation offers darker possibilities. A boy raised in isolation, taught that sex was sinful, suddenly forced to perform under observation by an entire court. His grandfather Louis XIV had kept him deliberately ignorant, fearing education would corrupt him. When wedding night arrived, Louis allegedly knew nothing about female anatomy, nothing about the mechanics of intercourse, nothing except that he was supposed to produce an heir while nobles listened through the door. Some historians suggest sexual aversion. Others point to evidence of what we'd now call performance anxiety, escalating into full psychological block. The pain Louis reported might have been real, but psychosomatic. The body manifesting what the mind couldn't process. This would explain why physicians disagreed. There was nothing consistently wrong to find. Then there's the conspiracy theory whispered in academic circles, but rarely published. What if Louis was intersex, or had a hormonal condition that affected development? The reluctance to conduct surgery, the vague descriptions in medical reports, the fact that even after supposed correction in 1777, there remained doubts about the children's paternity. This theory lacks hard evidence, but explains the gaps in the official narrative. The truth is, we'll never know. The royal physicians took their observations to graves that were themselves desecrated during the Revolution. Any medical records were destroyed or lost. Louis's body was buried in an unmarked grave, later exhumed and reinterred, making autopsy evidence impossible. The medical mystery is as dead as the patient. But here's what makes it genuinely unsettling. It doesn't matter. Whether Louis suffered from phimosis, psychological trauma, hormonal disorder, or simple inexperience, the outcome was identical. The propaganda machine didn't care about medical accuracy. The pamphleteers weren't interested in correct diagnosis. They took a human being's intimate suffering and weaponized it into political theater that ended with his head in a basket. History remembers the dysfunction. History forgets the human. 2 centuries of medical debate haven't restored Louis XIV's dignity. They've just extended the autopsy forever. The pamphleteers won. That's the part no one wants to acknowledge. Charles Thévenot de Morand, who printed pornographic libel about Louis XVI from his London basement, died wealthy in 1805. He outlived the king by 12 years, profiting from character assassination that helped topple a throne. History doesn't remember him as a murderer, though his ink spilled more royal blood than any guillotine blade. The techniques pioneered against Louis XVI became the blueprint for modern political destruction. Take intimate personal details, medical conditions, sexual dysfunction, private correspondence, and weaponize them into public spectacle. Transform complex human reality into simple, devastating narrative. Repeat the lie until it becomes indistinguishable from truth. The strategy didn't die with the Bourbons, it evolved. Napoleon Bonaparte studied the revolution's propaganda machinery with the same intensity he studied military tactics. When he seized power in 1799, he understood that controlling information was as crucial as controlling armies. He established state-controlled newspapers, censored opposition, and most tellingly, employed the same pamphleteers who'd destroyed Louis XVI to now glorify Emperor Napoleon. The tools were neutral. The wielder determined the target. The British adopted French techniques during the Napoleonic Wars, flooding France with anti-Bonaparte propaganda that mimicked the anti-monarchy materials from decades earlier. Napoleon portrayed as dwarf, as tyrant, as impotent despot unable to produce legitimate heirs with Josephine. The cycle repeated with roles reversed, proving the methodology's effectiveness transcended ideology. The 19th century saw this warfare go industrial. Steam-powered printing presses could produce millions of copies in hours. Photography added visual proof to supplement written accusation. By the time of the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate propagandists were using techniques perfected in 1780s Paris, taking leaders' private lives and transforming them into political liability. The 20th century refined the art to nightmare precision. Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, explicitly studied French revolutionary techniques, admiring how the pamphleteers had destroyed monarchy by making it personally contemptible before making it politically illegitimate. Soviet and Nazi propaganda both employed sexualized mockery of enemies, recognizing that people remember intimate humiliation longer than policy disagreements. What makes the victory truly complete is that we pretend it's different now. Modern political scandals, leaked emails, sex tapes, medical records exposed, follow the exact template established against Louis XVI. The technology changed from hand-pressed pamphlets to social media, but the psychology remains identical. Expose intimate weakness. Mock mercilessly. Repeat until the target's humanity dissolves into caricature. Louis XVI's destroyed dignity purchased knowledge that every subsequent political operative has exploited. The lesson was simple and permanent. People can forgive policy failures, economic disasters, even military defeat. But they cannot forgive the perception that a leader is fundamentally inadequate at a primal, bodily level. Make them laugh at the leader's body, and you've already won. The guillotine that killed Louis XVI was dismantled and stored away. The propaganda techniques that put him there are still in daily use. That's the real legacy. Not the king's execution, but the perfection of the machinery that made execution inevitable. We're all still living in the world those pamphleteers created, where intimate secrets are political weapons, and privacy is a luxury that power cannot afford. The printing presses have become servers. The pamphlets have become tweets. But Charles Thévenot de Morand would recognize the game instantly, and he would be proud. January 1998. President Bill Clinton stood before cameras and wagged his finger. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. 11 months later, the House of Representatives voted to impeach him. Not for policy, not for corruption in the traditional sense, for lying about sex. The pamphleteers of 1780s Paris would have understood instantly. The target changes. The weapon remains the same. Thomas Jefferson fathered children with enslaved woman Sally Hemings. His political enemies weaponized the relationship in newspapers that made 18th century libel look tame. Andrew Jackson's opponents called his wife Rachel a bigamist, claiming she'd married Jackson before her divorce finalized. Rachel died of a heart attack shortly after the campaign. Jackson blamed the stress of public humiliation. Grover Cleveland admitted fathering a child out of wedlock. Opponents paraded the baby through streets on banners. Ma, ma, where's my pa? The pattern transcends nations and centuries. In 1963, British Secretary of State for War John Profumo resigned after his affair with Christine Keeler became public. The actual security risk was minimal. The humiliation was total. French President François Mitterrand maintained a secret second family for decades. When exposed in 1994, the revelation damaged his legacy more than any policy failure. Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi's Bunga Bunga parties became international spectacle, reducing complex politics to sex scandal shorthand. Modern technology accelerated what printing presses started. Anthony Weiner's sexting scandal destroyed a congressional career in 2011. The photographs were less explicit than the cartoons drawn of Marie Antoinette, but distribution was instantaneous. Millions saw them within hours. John Edwards' affair and secret child ended his presidential campaign. Arnold Schwarzenegger's illegitimate son cost him marriage and reputation. Each scandal follows the Louis XVI template. Take intimate failure, make it public spectacle, watch credibility dissolve. The psychology exploits something fundamental in human nature. We can intellectually understand policy disagreements or economic mistakes, but intimate dysfunction bypasses rational thought and triggers visceral judgment. A leader who lies about sex becomes untrustworthy about everything. A leader who can't control personal urges becomes incapable of controlling government. The logic is primitive, but that's what makes it powerful. Social media perfected the distribution mechanism the pamphleteers could only dream about. A scandalous photograph doesn't need physical printing and distribution networks anymore. One click spreads it globally. Hashtags replace street songs. Memes replace cartoons. But the goal remains identical. Destroy credibility by destroying dignity. Make the audience see the leader's body, their weakness, their urges, their inadequacy, and political legitimacy evaporates. What's terrifying is the bipartisan nature of this warfare. Conservatives weaponize liberal scandals. Liberals weaponize conservative hypocrisy. Both sides employ techniques descended directly from the French revolutionary pamphleteers. Neither questions whether the weapon itself is moral. They only argue about who deserves to be targeted. Louis XV lost his head because private medical condition became public entertainment. 240 years later, careers still end the same way. The blade may be metaphorical now, but the severing is just as permanent. Privacy is the luxury that ambition cannot afford. And somewhere in history's shadows, Charles Thévenot de Morand laughs at how little has changed. Walk through Versailles today, and you'll find the bedroom where it all began. Tour guides point to the gold-embroidered bed where Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette spent their wedding night. Japanese tourists take photographs. School children giggle. Nobody mentions what didn't happen there. The palace has been sanitized into museum, its blood scrubbed clean, its ghosts given placards and visitor hours. But the truth haunts more effectively than any spectre. Louis XIV was not a tyrant. Historical records show him to be genuinely interested in Enlightenment philosophy, kind to servants, fascinated by science and geography. He funded the American Revolution, helping birth the democracy that would inspire France's own upheaval. He attempted reforms that would have modernized French governance decades before Napoleon. He was described by contemporaries as decent, moral, and earnest, perhaps too earnest for the vicious world of absolute monarchy. None of it mattered. History doesn't remember the locksmith king or the reformer who tried to save his country. History remembers the wedding night failure and the guillotine. The medical condition erased the man. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." That quote was propaganda, invented decades before she was born and falsely attributed to her during the Revolution. But it doesn't matter. The lie became truth through repetition, just as the 7 years of unconsummated marriage became permanent verdict on Louis's fitness to rule, regardless of the 4 children they eventually produced together. Their children paid the price for medical condition they never knew caused their parents' downfall. Louis Charles died at 10, alone in a dark prison cell, his body ravaged by disease and neglect. Marie-Thérèse survived, but spent her life haunted by memories of parents dragged to execution. The Blessed Union of 1770 produced not dynasty, but corpses and trauma. The cruelest irony sits in the Archives Nationales in Paris, preserved behind glass, a lock Louis XVI designed and built with his own hands. It's beautiful, intricate brass mechanism with 17 moving parts, each one clicking into place with mathematical precision. The king who couldn't control his body or his kingdom could make machines that worked perfectly. The man who failed at consummation succeeded at engineering. But engineering doesn't save thrones. 23 years separated the wedding night from the guillotine. 8 years of those were medical nightmare that became propaganda weapon. The remaining 15 were just aftermath. Waves radiating outward from a stone dropped in dark water, rippling until they drowned everything. The lesson France learned wasn't about governance or economics or Enlightenment ideals. The lesson was simpler and more savage. Expose weakness, mock relentlessly, and power will collapse. The blade that fell on Louis XVI's neck on January 21, 1793, had been sharpened for years in printing houses across Europe, one pamphlet at a time. Versailles still stands. The guillotine was dismantled long ago. But somewhere in the palace corridors, if you listen carefully past the tourists and their cameras, you can still hear it, the silence of that first failed wedding night, echoing through centuries teaching history how to destroy kings by destroying their dignity first. The most effective executions happen long before the blade ever falls.